The final bell at Daejeong High School rang with a tired, electronic buzz. It was a sound that signaled relief, a rushing out into the bright afternoon. In classroom 3B, the usual shuffle began. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped against the linoleum floor, and low chatter filled the air. Mr. Park, the old physics teacher, leaned against his desk. He watched his students leave. His eyes felt heavy. It had been a long week. Near the window, a boy named Jay was slow to pack. He was not a top student, but he had a curious mind. His notebook was open, not to class notes, but to a detailed sketch of a rocket, surrounded by frantic calculations. Across the aisle, a girl named Mina nervously reviewed a formula written on her palm, her lips moving silently. She always tried so hard. Soon, the room was empty except for Mr. Park and the gentle sound of someone erasing a board in the next classroom. He sighed, gathered his own things, and stepped into the hallway. The afternoon sun streamed through the big windows at the end of the corridor, painting the floor in long golden rectangles. It was quiet, peaceful. Next door, in room 3C, Ms. Lee Yuna finished her last class of the day. Calculus. For many students, it was a wall of confusing symbols. But she saw it as a language, a way to describe the shape of the world. Her students had just left, a mix of confusion and dawning understanding on their faces. She always found that moment satisfying. Now alone, she stood at the front of the quiet room. She was in her late 20s, with a calm and observant face. She picked up the eraser and began to clean the blackboard. Her movements were methodical. Each sweep of her arm left a cloudy trail, wiping away the day's lesson on differential equations. The only sounds were the soft squeak-squeak of the eraser and the distant noise of a soccer game from the field outside. She did not rush. There was a ritual to it. As the white chalk dust settled on the tray, her mind was already moving ahead. She thought about Jay from Mr. Park's class. She had seen his drawings. The boy had an engineer's mind, but he lacked confidence. She thought about Mina, who worked twice as hard as anyone else but was always afraid of making a mistake. She made a mental note to speak to them next week. Outside the classroom window, the sky was a clear, bright blue. A few seabirds circled. Daejeong High sat on a hill overlooking the city and the ocean. It was a beautiful, ordinary Thursday. Then the birds scattered. Ms. Lee paused, the eraser in her hand. She looked out the window. The blue sky seemed to darken, but not with clouds. It was a deep, purplish shadow spreading from the east, over the sea. It was silent. No rumble of thunder, no roar of engines. This silence was wrong. It was the silence of a television turned off. In the hallway, Mr. Park was locking his classroom door. He glanced out the window and froze. The golden sunlight was being eaten by the strange, advancing shadow. He saw shapes within it, sleek, angular silhouettes that blotted out the sun. They were not airplanes. They moved with a silence that felt heavy and dangerous. A low hum vibrated through the floor, through the bones of the building. Then, nothing. The main power died with a soft click. The overhead lights went out. The hum of the computers in the library down the hall ceased. A strange, greenish emergency light flickered on, casting long, jumping shadows. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. Then, a sound like 100 doors being kicked in at once echoed through the building. It was not an explosive sound, but a sharp, metallic crunch. Screams started, short and startled, then were quickly cut off. Not by violence, but by a wave of sheer, paralyzing shock. Ms. Lee dropped the eraser. It hit the floor with a puff of white dust. She stepped to the classroom door and peered into the hallway. What she saw made her blood run cold. Figures were coming out of the stairwells. They were tall, clad in armor that seemed to drink the light. It was a matte gray patterned like scales. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison. They did not run. They walked, swift and purposeful. Their faces were hidden behind smooth helmets with a single dark visor. They carried devices that looked like polished black rods. They did not shout. They did not fire weapons. They simply moved, hurting the few remaining students and teachers in the hallway with silent, threatening gestures. A teacher, Ms. Kim from history, tried to stand her ground. One of the figures pointed a rod. A pulse of blue light, not a bolt but a wave, enveloped her. She went rigid, then limp, floating in the air, guided by the same light toward the cafeteria doors. Mr. Park was pulled into the stream of people. He looked back, down the hall toward room 3C. His eyes met Ms. Lee's for a second. His were wide with fear. Then he was gone, pushed along by the silent, armored tide. Ms. Lee pulled her head back into her classroom, her heart pounding against her ribs. She leaned against the wall, breathing slowly. She could hear the soft shush-shush of armored feet passing her door. They were methodical, room by room. She looked around her empty classroom. The rows of empty desks. The clean blackboard, now only half erased. The world outside the window was now cast in the deep purple shadow of the enormous ships hovering above. This was an invasion, and they had come here to a school. She thought of Jay and his rocket drawings. She thought of Mina and her formulas. She thought of all the young, bright minds in the cafeteria, terrified. A cold, clear focus began to push aside her fear. This was her classroom. These were her students. The doorknob to room 3C began to turn. The doorknob stopped turning. The armored footsteps moved past, continuing down the hall. Ms. Lee let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. For a moment, she was alone again in the quiet classroom. But the quiet was different now. It was thin and sharp, like ice about to crack. The peaceful sounds of the school were gone, replaced by a distant, muffled chaos of shouts and crying from the lower floors. She knew she could not stay hidden. They were checking rooms. They would be back. She had to think. Moving quickly but without panic, she went to her desk. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside were spare chalk, dry markers, and a stack of old tests. Nothing that could be a weapon. Her hands closed around a small, heavy object wrapped in a soft cloth. It was a glass paperweight, a gift from her first class of students years ago. It was smooth and cool in her palm. It was not much, but its solid weight was a small comfort. She slipped it into the pocket of her trousers. She looked at the blackboard. The top half was still filled with the equations from her last lesson. They described rates of change, the slope of a curve at any given point. It was a language describing the world's motion. She stared at the symbols. dy/dx, the integral sign, the careful numbers. Her mind, trained for years in logic and patterns, began to work. What did they want? They hadn't started shooting. They were hurting people, not killing them. They used a tool to immobilize, not destroy. They wanted the building and the people in it intact. Hostages? Resources? Information? A new sound reached her ears. It was a voice, but it was wrong. It came from a speaker somewhere in the hall, flat and without emotion, like a computer speaking. It echoed through the silent corridors. All humans, move to the large central room. The cafeteria. Compliance ensures safety. Resistance will be neutralized. The words repeated. The voice was speaking perfect Korean, but there was no soul in it. It was a translation. Ms. Lee made her decision. To stay here was to be found hiding, and that might be seen as resistance. She had to go to the cafeteria. She had to see her students. She opened the classroom door slowly. The hallway was a scene from a nightmare. The green emergency lights made everything look sickly. A few backpacks and textbooks were scattered on the floor, dropped in the rush. At the far end, near the stairwell, two of the armored figures stood guard. They did not move. They were like statues, their dark visors watching. She stepped out and walked toward them. Her hands held slightly away from her body to show she was not a threat. Her shoes made soft clicks on the floor. The figures turned their heads in unison to watch her approach. She felt a chill, like being examined by a machine. One of them raised a rod, not pointing it at her, but gesturing down the stairs. A silent command. She went down. The stairwell was full of other teachers and students from the upper floors, all being moved along by more of the silent soldiers. She saw Mr. Park ahead, his arm around the shoulders of a crying younger student. He saw Ms. Lee and gave her a grim, helpless look. They were funneled into the main hallway on the ground floor. It was crowded and noisy with frightened whispers and stifled sobs. The alien soldiers lined the walls, still and watchful. Their technology was unsettling. A faint, shimmering field of light crackled over the main exit doors, blocking them. All the windows had the same blue, buzzing film over them. Ms. Lee scanned the crowd. She looked for familiar faces. There, near the water fountain, she saw Mina. The girl was pale, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white. Ms. Lee tried to catch her eye, to offer a small nod of reassurance. But Mina was staring at the floor, lost in terror. Then she saw Jay. He was not crying. He was looking around, his eyes darting from soldier to soldier, to the blocked doors, to the strange devices on their belts. He was observing, calculating. He was scared. She could see that in the tight line of his mouth, but his mind was working. He was trying to understand the machinery, the patterns. She felt a sudden, fierce pride. They were pushed into the cafeteria. The large room, usually bright with sunlight and the smell of food, was now a holding pen. The high windows were covered with the same energy field, casting a gloomy blue light over everything. Hundreds of students and all the school staff sat on the floor, huddled in groups. The soldiers stood around the edges, a ring of impassive gray armor. A taller soldier, with a single red mark on its shoulder, stepped onto a lunch table. It was the one who seemed to be in charge. The translated voice boomed from its helmet. "You will remain calm. You are valuable. You will not be harmed if you obey. Your cooperation is required for assessment." Assessment. The word hung in the air. What did that mean? Then the soldiers began to move through the crowd. They were not rough, but they were firm. They pulled the adults, the teachers, the cafeteria staff, the principal, to their feet. They were separating them from the students. "Where are you taking them?" a brave student shouted. A soldier merely pointed its rod, and the student flinched back into silence. Mr. Park was pulled up. The principal, a kind man named Mr. Choi, was led away. Ms. Lee felt a hand on her arm. It was not human. The grip was firm and cool through her sleeve. One of the soldiers was pulling her up. She looked back at the students. Her eyes found Jay again. He was watching her, his face full of worry. She gave him the smallest, most careful nod she could manage. "It will be okay." She hoped the message got through. The teachers were marched out of the cafeteria, down a different hallway toward the school's auditorium. As she walked, Ms. Lee did not look at the soldier guiding her. She looked at everything else. She counted the soldiers she passed. She noticed how the energy fields on the doors were generated from small devices placed at the frame. She saw how the soldiers communicated with slight tilts of their heads, a network without words. They were locked in the auditorium. The heavy doors sealed shut behind them with a magnetic thud. The room was dark except for the emergency lights on the stage. About 30 adults sat in the plush seats, some crying, some in stunned silence. Mr. Park sank into the seat next to her. "What do they want, Yuna?" he whispered, using her first name for the first time in years. "Why a school?" Ms. Lee looked at the sealed door, then at the high ceiling. Her mind was clear now, the initial fear burned away by a cold focus. They were being assessed. They were the teachers, the knowledge keepers. The invaders were intelligent. They were looking for something specific. "They didn't come for soldiers," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They came for a library, and they think we're the books." The air in the auditorium was thick with fear and the soft sounds of people trying not to cry. Ms. Lee sat very still in the plush seat. Her mind was not still. It was working, moving from fact to fact like solving a difficult problem on the board. They were the teachers. They had been separated. The invaders had called them valuable. They wanted an assessment. She looked around the dark room. Mr. Park had his head in his hands. The principal, Mr. Choi, was trying to speak calmly to a crying cafeteria worker. They were all smart people, good people, but they were not soldiers or scientists with secret weapons. They taught history, language, music, and math. Math. The thought clicked into place for Ms. Lee. The invaders had technology that could shut down power, create energy fields, and translate languages instantly. That technology was built on advanced physics, on engineering, on complex mathematics. To them, a planet's value might not be in its minerals, but in its knowledge. And a school was a place full of the most current knowledge, stored in the minds of the young and those who taught them. They were not hostages. They were specimens. They were files to be downloaded. The heavy auditorium door slid open with a smooth hiss. 2 soldiers stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the greenish hall light. They did not speak. One of them raised an arm and pointed into the room. A narrow beam of light shot from its glove and swept over the teachers, stopping on Ms. Lee. The light held on her chest, a tiny, bright dot. It was her. They wanted her. For a terrifying second, she thought they knew what she was thinking. Then she understood. They were picking at random. Or maybe they had a list. She was a calculus teacher. Advanced mathematics. She was exactly the kind of book they wanted to open first. Ms. Lee, Mr. Park whispered, fear in his eyes. She stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she made them move. She walked up the aisle toward the soldiers. Her heart beat hard in her throat. As she passed the principal, Mr. Choi gave her a look that was both an apology and a plea for strength. The soldiers turned and led her out. The door sealed shut behind her, leaving her alone with them in the hallway. The one who had pointed at her now gestured for her to walk ahead. They did not touch her. They just followed, their silent steps a soft pressure at her back. They did not go toward the cafeteria. Instead, they went up a different stairwell, back toward the classrooms. Why? Her mind raced. Were they taking her to a separate place to be questioned? To be assessed? They stopped at a familiar door. Room 3C. Her classroom. One of the soldiers reached past her and opened the door, pointed inside. The meaning was clear, go in. Confusion swirled with her fear. Why bring her back here? She stepped into her room. It was exactly as she had left it. The half-erased board, her desk, the rows of empty desks. The afternoon light from the window was now a strange purple color, filtered through the ships outside. The soldier followed her in, pointed to her desk. On it lay her attendance notebook, the one she had forgotten in her rush. The soldier's translated voice came from its helmet, flat and direct. You will retrieve the record. You will then come with us. So that was it. A simple errand. They were being thorough. They wanted all records, all data. Her attendance book was just another piece of information. Relief washed over her, but it was thin and cold. She was still their prisoner. She was just fetching something first. She walked to her desk and picked up the small notebook. As she did, her eyes fell on the blackboard. The equations she had not finished erasing seemed to stare back at her. In the quiet of the room, with the armored soldier waiting by the door, those symbols felt like old friends. They were a truth that did not change, even when the world went mad. The second soldier remained in the hallway. The one in her classroom took a step closer. It was impatient. Now, the voice said. Ms. Lee turned from her desk, the notebook in her hand. She took a step toward the door, then stopped. She looked at the chalk tray. A single, long piece of white chalk lay there, clean and untouched. An idea, wild and desperate, bloomed in her mind. It was not a plan of attack. It was a plan of communication. These creatures valued knowledge. They used logic. They did not understand human resistance, but they would understand a proof. They would understand a language they thought was universal, mathematics. She looked at the soldier, then at the board. Her voice was quieter than she expected when she spoke. I need to finish something first. The soldier did not react for a moment. Perhaps its translation software was processing the odd request. Then it raised the black rod in its hand. It was a warning. Compliance. Now. Ms. Lee ignored the rod. She ignored the fear screaming in her chest. She walked to the blackboard, her back to the soldier. She put the attendance book down on the tray and picked up the piece of chalk. Her hand trembled. She willed it to be steady. She touched the chalk to the board, next to her old lesson. With a smooth, clear line, she began to write. She was not writing random numbers. She started with what she could observe. She wrote the time of day the shadow had fallen over the school. She wrote the angle of the sunlight from her window at that time. She began to derive, step by logical step, the approximate altitude of the ships blocking the sun. Her writing was fast, focused. She moved from basic geometry to orbital mechanics. Behind her, the soldier moved. It did not grab her. It took a step closer, its helmet tilted. It was watching the board. On its dark visor, faint lines of soft green light began to scroll, reflecting the equations she was writing. She did not stop. She used her derived altitude. She factored in the gravitational constant of Earth. She calculated the necessary velocity for an object to maintain that position. She was reverse engineering their own parking orbit in space, using only the observations from a school window and the laws of physics. She heard a soft, electronic click from the soldier's helmet. A scan. It was analyzing what she was writing. Ms. Lee took a deep breath. This was the dangerous part. This was the message. She began a new line of calculation. She used the velocity and a theoretical point of origin, a star system from where such a journey might logically begin, based on known human astronomy. She was not just calculating where they were. She was sketching a map of where they had come from. The soldier's rod came up again, this time aimed directly at her back. A low hum filled the room, but it did not fire. A different voice crackled in the air. It came from the soldier's helmet, but it was not the flat translation voice. It was another voice, deeper, with more authority. It spoke in a series of sharp, clicking sounds. Then the translation overlay kicked in. Cease action. The soldier in the hallway had stepped in, its own weapon raised. The new voice was coming from it. It was the one with the red mark. The commander. Ms. Lee finished her last symbol, a small arrow pointing to a set of coordinates she had derived. She put the chalk down slowly. She turned around to face them, her hands empty and visible. The two soldiers stood perfectly still, their weapons aimed at her. But they were not looking at her. They were looking at the board, at the trail of white symbols that led from a simple observation to the secret of their journey. The commander took a step forward, its dark visor scanning the equations. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of their weapons. The teacher stood by the blackboard, waiting. The chalk dust was a pale cloud on her fingers. The low hum of the alien weapons filled the silent classroom. Ms. Lee stood perfectly still, her back to the blackboard. Her chalk-dusted hands held slightly away from her body. The two soldiers were frozen, their weapons pointed at her, but their focus was entirely on the wall of white writing behind her. The commander, the soldier with the red mark, took another slow step forward. Its helmet tilted as it scanned the equations, line by line. On its dark visor, the green scrolling light moved rapidly, like a river of symbols. It was reading, analyzing. Ms. Lee watched it, her heart pounding a hard, steady rhythm against her ribs. She had not written a weapon. She had written a question. She had written, in the universal language of mathematics, a simple, terrifying statement. I see you. The commander's translated voice broke the silence. It was no longer giving orders. It was asking, what is this meaning? It spoke the words carefully, as if tasting each one. The flat computer tone was gone, replaced by a voice that held a note of something new. Confusion, and perhaps a hint of alarm. Ms. Lee kept her own voice calm and clear. She nodded toward the board. It is a calculation. It is the path you took to get here. The other soldier made a sharp, mechanical sound, a click of protest or warning. The commander raised a hand, a human-like gesture that made it seem suddenly less like a machine. It silenced the soldier without a word. Explain. The word was a command, but it was also a request. Ms. Lee turned slightly, pointing to the first part of her work. This is the angle of the sun at the moment your ships arrived. This is the resulting shadow length. From that, I calculated the approximate height of your main vessel above the school. She moved her finger along the lines. Using that altitude and the known gravity of Earth, I calculated the required orbital velocity to maintain that position without falling or flying away. She paused, letting the translation catch up. The commander was motionless, absorbing it. "This," she said, her finger resting on the final, most dangerous set of symbols, "is a probable point of origin, a star system whose position relative to ours would allow for the journey profile these calculations suggest. It is an estimate, but it is a logical one." The classroom was so quiet she could hear the faint buzz of the energy field covering the windows. The commander stared at the final coordinates. The green light on its visor flashed, then settled into a slow, steady pulse. "You derive this," it said slowly, "from observation, from mathematics." "Yes," Ms. Lee said. She gestured to the rest of the board, to her earlier lesson on rates of change. "This is what I teach. This is what my students learn. Not how to build ships or weapons. How to understand the rules of the universe. How to take a piece of information, like a shadow, and follow it to a truth." The commander took a final step, standing right before the blackboard. It reached out a gloved hand, but did not touch the chalk marks. It hovered over them, as if feeling the heat of the idea. "You are a teacher," it stated. It was not a question this time. It was a realization. "I am," Ms. Lee replied. "And in the cafeteria there are hundreds of students. Some are better at this than I am. Some, like Jay, spend their free time drawing engines. Others, like Mina, work until they master every formula. You came to a place where young minds are trained to do exactly this, to observe, to calculate, to solve." The commander's head turned from the board to look at her. Behind the dark visor, she could see nothing, but she felt the weight of its attention. "Your species guards its knowledge in strongholds. In vaults," the commander said, its voice low. "We scanned for energy signatures, for data cores, for military encryption. We found a weak signal cluster here. We assumed it was a storage node, a place of files." A cold understanding settled in Ms. Lee's stomach. They had seen the school's computer network, the Wi-Fi, the digital library. To them, it looked like a primitive data server. They came to download it. They didn't understand that the real knowledge wasn't in the machines. It was in the people. It was walking around, scared, in the cafeteria. "The files are not in the computers," she said softly. "The files are in them, and in me, and in every teacher you locked in the auditorium. We do not just hold knowledge. We create it. We spread it. You can lock up a computer. You cannot lock up a thought." The commander turned back to the board. It looked at the coordinates of its home system, written in simple chalk by a human in a room full of empty desks. "This data is a vulnerability," it said. The translated word was heavy. "If you can do this, others of your kind can." Ms. Lee met the blank visor. "Yes. If one teacher in one classroom can figure out where you came from, what do you think will happen when thousands of people, engineers, scientists, students, start looking? You took away our power. You did not take away our minds. Your secrecy was your shield. Now that shield is gone. It ended here." She did not smile. She did not threaten. She simply stated a fact, as clearly as she had stated the laws of physics on the board. The commander stood in silence for a long time. The other soldier lowered its weapon, confused. The humming stopped. Finally, the commander turned away from the blackboard. It made a series of rapid clicks and tones into its helmet. Across the school, in the cafeteria and the auditorium, the soldiers stiffened, receiving new orders. The commander looked at Ms. Lee one last time. It did not see a soldier or a leader or a piece of valuable data. It saw a woman in a simple sweater, with chalk on her hands, standing in front of a lesson. "The assessment," it said, the word now sounding hollow, "is complete." Without another word, it turned and walked out of the classroom. The other soldier followed. Ms. Lee was left alone, the echo of their steps fading down the hall. Outside the window, the deep purple shadow over the school began to lighten. The ships were moving. Ms. Lee stood alone in the center of her classroom. The silence was immense. It was not the quiet of an empty school at the end of the day. It was the heavy, ringing silence that comes after a great noise has stopped. She could hear her own heartbeat slowing in her ears. Her fingers, still dusty with chalk, trembled slightly. She looked at the blackboard. The equations she had written stared back, a strange and powerful scar on the ordinary green surface. They were no longer just a lesson. They were proof of something. From the hallway, she heard new sounds. Not the soft, menacing steps of the armored soldiers, but a different kind of movement. It was a series of quick, precise clicks and whirs, like many machines powering down at once. Then, the low, constant buzz that had filled the building, the sound of the energy fields on the doors and windows, suddenly ceased. The absence of the sound was as startling as a crash. Light changed. The strange, gloomy blue cast over everything vanished. The normal afternoon sun, now free of the giant shadows outside, poured suddenly through the classroom window. It was warm and bright and real. It lit up the floating chalk dust in the air like gold. Ms. Lee walked to the door. She hesitated for a second, then pulled it open. The hallway was empty of soldiers. At the far end, the main exit door was just a door again. No shimmering field, no guards. But on the floor, placed neatly against the wall, were the small, disc-like devices that had generated the energy fields. They were dark and inert. They were leaving. They were really leaving. She began to walk, her steps quickening. She passed other classroom doors, all closed. She did not go to the auditorium first. She went to the stairs and hurried down toward the cafeteria. As she reached the ground floor, she saw other teachers tentatively emerging from the auditorium door. Mr. Park saw her first. His face, pale with fear, filled with relief and confusion. "Yuna, what happened?" "They just walked out. They opened the door and left." "They're gone," she said, her voice firm. "It's over." She didn't stop to explain. She pushed open the double doors to the cafeteria. The scene inside was one of frozen shock. Hundreds of students were still sitting on the floor where they had been left. The ring of soldiers was gone. The tall soldier who had stood on the table was gone. The only signs they had ever been there were a few faint scuff marks on the floor and the same small, dead devices placed by the blocked windows. All eyes turned to Ms. Lee as she entered. A sea of young, frightened faces looked to her for an answer. For a moment, no one made a sound. Then Jay stood up. He was looking past her, out the cafeteria's large windows. He pointed, his mouth open in disbelief. Outside, the sleek, terrifying ships were lifting silently into the sky. They did not roar away in a show of power. They retreated. They rose steadily, shrinking into specks against the blue, until they were gone. A single, shaky sob broke the quiet. Then another. Then the room erupted into a wave of sound. Crying, shouting, questions tumbling over each other. Teachers rushed in from the hall, moving to comfort students to check for injuries. Ms. Lee moved through the crowd. She went straight to Mina, who was still sitting, hugging her knees. The girl looked up, her eyes wide and wet. "Ms. Lee, what did you do?" Before she could answer, Jay was there too. His curiosity had burned through his fear. "They took you away. Then they all left at once. It was coordinated. What happened?" Ms. Lee looked at their faces. Mina, who mastered formulas, and Jay, who dreamed of rockets. She had done it for them. She had done it because of them. "I just talked to them," she said, which was both true and not the whole truth, in a language they understood. Mr. Choi, the principal, made his way to her. He put a hand on her shoulder. His own hand was shaking. "The police and army are on their way. The phones are working again. Everyone is saying the ships are leaving the city, leaving the country." "Ms. Lee, what in the world did you say?" She looked around the cafeteria, at the community of her school, scared but intact. She thought of the commander's final words. "The assessment is complete." "I think," she said slowly, "they came to give us a test, and we passed." She knew it was more than that. They had come to take, but they had encountered something they could not take. They had found a library where the books could read the librarians. They had found a species whose weapon was not a hidden army, but a visible, teachable mind. A mind in every student, in every teacher. A mind that could turn a shadow into a map. The authorities would arrive soon. There would be questions, stories, chaos. The world would want to know how an invasion was stopped at a high school. They would look for heroes with guns or secret codes. But here, in this room, the students who had seen her taken away now looked at her differently. They saw the chalk dust on her clothes. They saw the calm in her face. They didn't know what she had done, but they knew she had done something. Jay helped Mina to her feet. They were so advanced, he murmured, almost to himself. But they didn't know about us. They didn't know what we learn here. Ms. Lee gave him a small, tired smile. That was the lesson, the most important one. It wasn't on any syllabus. Outside, the first sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The ordinary world was rushing back in to fill the space the aliens had vacated. The nightmare was ending in the bright light of a simple afternoon. Ms. Lee took one last look at her students, safe and whole, then turned to walk back toward her classroom. There was a board there that needed to be erased. The sirens grew louder, a rising and falling wail that sliced through the quiet that had settled over the school. Blue and red lights flashed against the cafeteria windows, painting the faces of the students in strange, moving colors. The outside world had arrived. There was a great noise of doors being pushed open, of heavy boots in the hallways. Soldiers in human uniforms, their faces tight with confusion and urgency, poured into the cafeteria. Police officers followed, talking quickly into radios. They had come prepared for a war zone. They found only children and teachers, shaking but unharmed, standing in a room littered with lunch bags and abandoned notebooks. The principal, Mr. Choi, moved to meet them, holding up his hands. It's okay. They're gone. Everyone is safe. An army captain, a man with a grim face, scanned the room. Gone? The ships just retreated. What happened here? Was there a fight? A negotiation? Mr. Choi looked back, his eyes searching for Ms. Lee. But she was no longer in the cafeteria. She had slipped away in the first moments of the commotion. The hallway was now crowded with emergency workers and soldiers, all moving with a tense, brisk energy. No one stopped the teacher with chalk on her hands. She walked through them as if she were invisible, a ghost from the quiet moment before the world crashed in. She needed to get back to her classroom. Her mind was quiet now, the sharp focus gone, leaving behind a deep tiredness. But one thing needed to be done. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Up here it was still peaceful. The echoes of the chaos below were muffled. The afternoon sun streamed through the hallway windows, just as it had before. She opened the door to room 3C. It was exactly as she had left it. The sun illuminated the particles of dust dancing in the air. And there, on the green expanse of the blackboard, were her 2 lessons. On the left, the neat, orderly lines of that day's calculus. On the right, the frantic, powerful scrawl of her derivation, the angles, the velocities, the star map. She stood before it, the chalk tray cool under her fingers. This was the evidence. This was the thing that had changed everything. To anyone else, it would just look like complicated math. But she knew. The commander had known. Outside, she could hear a helicopter thrumming closer, probably news media. Soon, people with cameras and recorders would be everywhere. They would want a story. They would want to turn this into something simple. A battle. A miracle. But it wasn't either of those things. It was a conversation. A very dangerous one, held in the only language both sides truly shared. Logic. If she left the equations there, they would be photographed. They would be analyzed by military scientists and television experts. They would become a symbol, a piece of a story that would grow and change until the truth was buried. The coordinates she had written, her best guess, her logical estimate, would become a fact. They could become a target. They could start a new fear, a new kind of war, out there among the stars. She had used the knowledge as a shield. She would not let it become a spear. She picked up the eraser, felt familiar and heavy in her hand. She started on the right side of the board. She swept the eraser over the coordinates first. They vanished in a cloud of white dust. Then the velocity calculations. Then the orbital mechanics. With each long, smooth stroke, a piece of the dangerous truth disappeared. The numbers and symbols that had held a silent invasion force at bay were wiped away, leaving only a faint, gray smear. She worked methodically, just as she had after her last class. This was just another lesson to be cleared for the next day. As she erased the final symbol, the door to the classroom opened softly. She did not turn around. She knew who it was. Jay stood in the doorway, hesitant. He had followed her. He had seen her leave. He watched her now, erasing the last of the strange math from the afternoon. "Why are you getting rid of it?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not accusing, just curious. "That's what you showed them, isn't it? That's what made them leave." Ms. Lee finished, tapping the eraser on the tray. The board was clean, a blank green slate. She turned to face him. "It served its purpose, Jay. Its purpose was to protect you, to protect everyone downstairs. If it stays, its purpose might change. It might become a reason for someone else to be afraid or to fight. Some lessons are just for the moment you learn them." Jay stepped into the room, his eyes on the empty board. They were so powerful, but they were scared of math. "Not scared," Ms. Lee said, correcting him gently. "They were logical. They saw that the knowledge was not locked in a vault. It was here." She tapped her own temple. "And in you, and in Mina. They saw that they couldn't take it without it fighting back. A locked door can be broken, but an idea, once it's seen, it can't be unseen." They realized every human they met was a door, and every door led to the same truth. Jay thought about this. He looked at the clean board, then out the window at the clear sky. "So we just go back to normal after this?" Ms. Lee smiled a small, sad smile. "No, we won't go back to normal, but we will go forward. And you will study for your tests, and I will teach my classes. Because that is what we do. That is the system they didn't understand. We teach, we learn, we keep going." From downstairs, they could hear voices, official and loud, calling for the teacher. The one who had been with the aliens. Ms. Lee put the eraser down. She looked at Jay. "You should go back down. Your parents will be looking for you." He nodded but didn't move. "What will you tell them?" he asked, meaning the soldiers, the reporters, the world. Ms. Lee looked at the blank blackboard, then at her chalk-dusted hands. She would tell them the truth, but not the whole truth. She would say she talked. She would say the aliens left. The most important part, the quiet, logical war that had been fought with symbols on a board, was already gone. It was a story for this room alone. "I will tell them," she said, "that it's over." Jay finally turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Ms. Lee was alone again with the clean slate. The classroom was ready for tomorrow. A uniformed aide opened the heavy door. "They're ready for you, Ms. Lee." Ms. Lee nodded and stood up from the stiff chair in the government building hallway. The room she entered was plain, with gray walls and a long table. Several important-looking people sat on one side. There was the army captain from the school, 2 men in dark suits from National Intelligence, and a woman with glasses from the Ministry of Education. A recording device sat in the center of the table, its red light glowing. For a week, the story had been everywhere. Alien ships, a school, a mysterious retreat. The world was hungry for an answer, for a hero, for a weapon. "Please sit," said one of the intelligence men. "We appreciate your patience. We just need to understand the sequence of events one final time." Ms. Lee sat. Her hands, clean now, were folded in her lap. She wore simple clothes. She looked like what she was, a teacher on a weekday. "You were taken from the auditorium to your classroom," the captain began, his notes in front of him, "to retrieve an item." "Yes, my attendance book. And the 2 alien soldiers escorted you. What happened then?" Ms. Lee spoke in the same calm, clear tone she used to explain a complex theorem. "They waited by the door. I got the book. Then they told me to come with them." The woman from the Education Ministry leaned forward. "And is that when you communicated with them? We have statements from students saying you were talking to them before they left." "I asked if I could finish erasing my blackboard," Ms. Lee said. "It was an old habit. The lesson was still there. They paused. I erased it. Then I went with them back to the hallway. Soon after that, all the soldiers left. The people at the table exchanged glances. This was the third time she had told this story. It never changed. It was simple, ordinary, and frustratingly empty of drama. The intelligence man tapped his pen. Ms. Lee, their technology was vastly superior. They disabled our entire city's power grid. They had no reason to leave. Yet, after interacting with you, a single teacher, they retreated globally. You understand why this is hard to accept. I do, Ms. Lee said. But it is what happened. Perhaps they got what they came for. Or perhaps they didn't find what they wanted. I don't know what they were thinking. This was the truth, but not all of it. She did know. They had found a library of living, thinking books. They had assessed the danger of a species that could not be disarmed by turning off its machines. But that truth lived only in her memory, and in the memory of a silent commander who had seen a star map drawn in chalk. The captain sighed, closing his folder. You're free to go, Ms. Lee. The nation is, of course, grateful. Your school will be commended. She stood, thanked them, and walked out of the room. Her story was now the official one. A puzzling incident ended by unknown alien reasons. It was a mystery. The world could live with a mystery. It might be better than knowing the real, fragile reason. 2 days later, school reopened. Felt different. The building was the same, but the air had changed. There were news vans outside the gates for a while, but they had left. Now it was just students walking through the doors, their steps slower, their voices softer. Ms. Lee stood in front of her class. Room 3C. The blackboard was spotless. Sunlight fell across the desks where Jay and Mina and all the others sat. They looked at her, waiting. They were not waiting for calculus. They were waiting for something else. She picked up a piece of chalk. Last week, she began, her voice filling the quiet room. We were discussing rates of change, how we can measure the moment something becomes something else. She turned to the board and wrote a simple equation. Let's continue. For a moment, nothing happened. Then notebooks opened. Pens were picked up. The ordinary sounds of a classroom returned, fragile at first, then growing stronger. Jay watched her, not the board. He saw the calm certainty in her shoulders. He saw the chalk, an ordinary tool, in her hand. He looked down at his own notebook, at the rocket he had drawn in the margin. This time, he started writing numbers next to it. Thrust, Massachusetts force. Mina, seeing Jay begin to work, took a deep breath and focused her eyes on the equation. She began to break it down piece by logical piece, following the path. The lesson went on. It was not about aliens or invasions. It was about the relationship between distance, speed, and time. It was about understanding the world. When the bell rang, the students packed up more slowly than before. As they filed out, Mina paused at Ms. Lee's desk. Thank you, Ms. Lee, she whispered, and then she was gone. Jay was last. He stopped at the door. It's really over, isn't it? Ms. Lee was erasing the board again. The soft squeak filled the room. She turned and looked at him. The visit is over, she said. The lesson isn't. What we do here, Jay, this is how we go forward. We learn. We build. We understand. That is our system. And it is always on. He nodded, a understanding deeper than words passing between them. Then he left. Alone, Ms. Lee finished cleaning the board. She looked out the window at the empty sky. Somewhere up there, the commander and its people were traveling home, their assessment complete. They had come for a database and found a civilization built not on data, but on teachers and students, on questions and answers that never ended. She placed the chalk back in the tray. The board was blank, ready for the next day, the next question, the next young mind ready to learn. In the quiet classroom, there was no victory celebration, no monument. There was only chalk dust in the sunlight, and the silent, powerful promise of tomorrow's lesson.